Well, thank you, Andrew, and I'd like to thank PDF for inviting me back. It really is a privilege to be here. In my experience, this is a unique event with a much broader scope than many of the events that I typically appear at, which focus somewhat myopically on fairly arcane aspects of telecom regulation and policy. It really is refreshing to have a chance to step back from that perspective and look at this world through a much broader perspective. This morning, I plan to share some of my thoughts about the public policy framework that we have around telecommunications in general and the internet in particular in this country. Let me say up front that these views are really my own, and they are not necessarily representative of what AT&T would say about these matters, though hopefully they are not in conflict. My basic point is going to be that changes in technology, changes in society, changes in commercial relationships, and changes in the way we think about public policy issues have really rendered much of the pre-existing framework for public policy in this area increasingly incoherent over time. My basic point is that at some point, and I hope some point relatively soon, we really have to create a new framework for this policy in this area. Many of the problems that I will discuss are widely recognized and have been known about for a decade or longer. Indeed, some of them have been known about for more than half a century. They nonetheless continue to hamper investment, innovation, and in my opinion, human progress. To help make these points, I have a timeline here. The point of this timeline is really just to illustrate how some things have changed and how other things have not changed quite as much. I chose the points on the timeline somewhat arbitrarily. Many important points are left off, but nonetheless, I think the timeline will help me make my case. Let's see if it works. Okay, 1874. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. This is obviously there were other technologies in use at this time. There's actually a lot of dispute about whether Bell was really the inventor of the telephone. There were competing patent applications. It's a very intriguing history in its own right, but I'm not going to go into it here today. As I said, arbitrarily chosen. The next point that I want to point to is the passage of the Communications Act of 1934. This was really, a New Deal era attempt to formalize in a single sector-specific regulator, regulation of communications by wire and radio. Importantly, the 1934 Act created a set of regulatory silos that put traditional common carrier services in one bucket, broadcast services in another. Over time, that was expanded. There was a title created for cable services, wireless services. So it created a structure where we had all these different services. They were all given their own unique regulatory sort of bucket that they lived in. And this had significant ramifications because this not only affected federal regulation, but also state and local. It created, basically the world we have today where these services are all subject to different and varying regulation by different and varying institutions at different levels. In 1943, Vint Cerf, one of the fathers of the internet, was born. Maybe I'm the only one who thinks it's a little ironic that Vint and Alexander Graham Bell bear some resemblance to each other, but I think that's funny. In 1947, Bell Labs proposed the creation of cell service and cell phones. I think when we think about telecom policy sort of across the 20th century and into this century, we really recognize that there's been this movement from the world where Bell Labs was part of this massive monopoly to a world where what we strive for is to create competition and openness. If you go forward now to 1969 and really starting to presage what Vint worked on, we have the first link set up for ARPANET. This is really the beginning of a transition to packet switch networks ultimately that has completely transformed communications and communications networks. In 1971, AT&T went to the FCC and proposed the creation of cell phone service. In 1982, TCP/IP was standardized. This, to me, was a seminal moment in communications and networking. 1983, that's what a cell phone looked like. It's kind of different from what we have now. 1984, we had another important birth, but also divestiture of AT&T. This was the separation of the long-distance business from the local businesses, the separation of the equipment business. And this was really, to me, change was starting to accelerate now at this point in time. So in 1996, I think in recognition of that change, the legislature, the Congress got together and said, you know what, we're going to pass an act to update that 1934 statute. And so that's what they tried to do in the 96 Act. We can talk a little about how well they succeeded. So now we come to today, and we've given birth now to this world that's incredibly different from the world of certainly Alexander Graham Bell, but certainly also the 34 Act or the point of divestiture or even the 96 Act. As I said, the point of my timeline is really just to illustrate some changes that have happened, but to note that from a public policy perspective, we're basically still working under the framework created under the 34 Act with these regulatory silos and whatever the 96 Act has that's relevant. I also mentioned that there are important points that aren't on here. And one of them, to me, one of the most important points that I would like to have put on here but didn't was in 1959, an economist named Ronald Coase wrote a paper called the Federal Communications Commission, in which he laid out the case for auctioning off spectrum instead of assigning it through government fiat. At the time, Coase was ridiculed by many, including undoubtedly predecessors of me at AT&T. But Coase proved very, I would say, very insightful, and some of the barriers we have today to investment and innovation are a result, in my opinion, of changes that go back to that change in understanding, predate Coase's insight. So a lot of talk today in DC about how do we do incentive auctions to enable spectrum currently allocated to broadcast TV to be used for mobile broadband services. Ultimately, the reason that there's so much friction in that area is, of course, that spectrum was originally assigned under that old paradigm that Coase really, I think, revolutionized ultimately. So as we've seen, the world of telecommunications has changed a lot. The Internet protocol and the Internet itself have brought us to this era of convergence, where services that were formerly segregated on different networks now run side by side on thousands of networks, ranging from the network you run at your home to networks run by companies like AT&T, traditional telecom companies, to networks run by companies that we think of as internet companies like Amazon. That's what the Internet is. It's the combination of all of those networks. Meanwhile, the framework for public policy is still founded primarily on the structure created by the legislation passed in 1934 and 1996. The 34 Act divides the world into silos that TCP/IP has destroyed. The 96 Act was adopted just as the world was changing, and for the most part, it missed all that change. I think someone told me the word Internet appears in the 96 Act less than 5 times. This framework that we have today makes little sense for the world of 2007. It is a barrier to change, irrespective of what you think that change should be comprised of. It really must be replaced. Where we go from here, the real question now isn't should we replace this framework or not? It's what should we replace it with? And I don't have time today to go into any great detail on my views on that, but I would suggest that we need to start with first principles and really start with institutional questions. I think the most basic question is whether going forward it makes sense to retain sector-specific regulation in a world of convergence. Congressman Chaffetz mentioned the efforts underway to look at privacy and location information. This location information is information that is not only potentially in the possession of traditional telecom providers, but it reaches across the entire ecosystem, handset makers, application providers. The idea of a sort of sector-specific regulation in this era, I think, is questionable. And moreover, there are dangers of sector-specific regulation that are well known, including but not limited to the problem of capture. I thank PDF again for inviting me to be here. I hope that the democratic process will take up this hard problem of thinking about how do we bring our framework for telecom regulation into the 21st century. Thank you.